Around 900,000 years ago, there may have been only about 1,280 breeding humans left on Earth. Not villages, not families, 1,280 individuals capable of having children. The entire future of our species balanced on a number smaller than most high schools. If that number had dropped any lower, there would likely be no humans alive to read this sentence. This isn't speculation from a documentary script. It comes from one of the strangest discoveries in modern genetics, and to understand it, you need to understand what scientists call a population bottleneck. Imagine pouring 1,000 marbles through a wide funnel. Most of them pass through easily. But now, make the neck of that funnel almost impossibly narrow, and only a handful of marbles can fit through at a time. Whatever falls outside that narrow path is gone forever. Whatever survives, however random, becomes the starting point for everything downstream. A population bottleneck works the same way. A species can exist in large, genetically diverse numbers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then something happens, numbers crash, the vast majority of the population dies out or fails to reproduce, and whoever survives, by chance more than merit, becomes the genetic seed for every individual that comes after. And here's the unsettling part. Scientists didn't discover this from fossils. They discovered it by looking at your DNA. In 2023, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Science that reconstructed ancient human population history using a new genetic method, and what they found was striking. Between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the breeding population of early humans appears to have collapsed by around 98.7%. The estimate that emerged was unsettling in its specificity, somewhere around 1,280 individuals. To put that in perspective, there are more people inside many football stadiums than there were humans left on Earth. For context, modern conservationists consider a population critically endangered once it drops below a few thousand breeding individuals. By that standard, if human history were compressed into 1 year, our species spent weeks balanced on extinction. So, what caused it? The surprising answer is that scientists don't know with certainty, but the timing points strongly toward climate. This period falls within what's known as the Mid Pleistocene transition, a time when the pattern of ice ages themselves changed. Ice ages became longer, colder, and more extreme, locking up enormous amounts of water in ice sheets and dramatically altering rainfall patterns across the planet. Africa, where early humans were living at the time, didn't escape this. Evidence from ancient lake sediments and pollen records suggests this period brought long stretches of extreme dryness. Lakes that had sustained human populations for generations are believed to have dried up. Grasslands that supported the animals early humans hunted may have shrunk or disappeared entirely. It probably didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt more like one dry season, then another and another. The wells running shallower, the rains arriving less often, the migration routes of animals shifting toward regions you can no longer follow. There is no single moment of crisis, just the long, grinding erosion of survivability. But climate alone doesn't explain the strangest part. Most of the population didn't die in a single catastrophic event. They likely just stopped having enough surviving children to replace themselves. Generation after generation, the numbers ground downward. So why didn't we disappear completely? This is where genetics becomes important, because the consequences of a bottleneck don't end when the population stabilizes. They get written permanently into the DNA of every descendant. Imagine shuffling a deck of cards. Now throw away 98% of the deck. Whatever cards remain become the only cards future generations will ever play with. That's essentially what happened to humans. When a population collapses to a few thousand individuals, something called genetic drift takes over. In large populations, genetic variation is preserved because there are simply enough individuals carrying different versions of genes that none of them disappear easily. But in a small population, random chance starts to dominate. A gene variant carried by only a few individuals can vanish completely if those individuals happen not to reproduce, regardless of whether that variant was helpful, harmful, or irrelevant. The result is a dramatic narrowing of genetic diversity, and researchers studying this bottleneck found exactly that signature in the human genome, a noticeable drop in genetic variation that lines up with this same window in time. This matters because genetic diversity is normally a buffer. The more variation a species carries, the more resilient it is to disease, environmental change, and the unpredictable pressures of survival. A severe bottleneck strips much of that buffer away. The population that emerges afterward is descended from a narrower genetic starting point than the population that existed before. Every human alive today, every person on every continent, carries the genetic fingerprint of having passed through this narrow opening. We are, in a very real sense, the descendants of survivors of a near-extinction event we don't consciously remember and have no records of, only a faint signature buried in our genes. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This same period, right around when the bottleneck occurred, also lines up with significant changes in the human fossil record. Some researchers have proposed that this population crisis may have acted as an evolutionary pressure cooker. With numbers this low, every small genetic shift had a high chance of spreading through the entire surviving population. Traits that may have helped some of the survivors get through this harsh climate didn't have to compete with much genetic noise to become dominant. The bottleneck, by virtue of compressing the population so severely, may have accelerated certain evolutionary changes that would otherwise have taken far longer to take hold. Some researchers have linked this period to important transitions toward the lineage that eventually gave rise to Homo sapiens, though this connection is still actively debated and far from settled science. But here's the part that's hardest to sit with. This wasn't humanity overcoming a threat through intelligence, tools, or cooperation in any way we can point to directly. As far as the evidence shows, this was simply about which small group of individuals happened to be in the right place when the climate turned, and which happened not to be. There was no explosion, no asteroid, no final battle. Just a world becoming slightly harder to survive and an almost impossibly thin thread of survivors who happened to make it through, one generation at a time, until eventually the climate stabilized and human numbers began to recover. Every relationship you've ever had, every thought you've ever formed, every person you've ever loved, all of it traces back through an unbroken chain of ancestors who survived a period when our entire species came astonishingly close to not existing at all. You are not just the product of evolution rewarding the strongest or the smartest. You are the product of a roll of the dice that happened to land in our favor. If even a slightly worse drought had hit, if a slightly smaller number of those 1,280 people had survived to raise children, or if the climate had shifted just a little further in the wrong direction, then every civilization, invention, and human who has ever lived wouldn't have existed. Nobody would. The fact that you exist at all is not something evolution guaranteed. It's something that very nearly didn't happen.